Chapter 1. Knocknashee, Dingle Peninsula, County Kerry. April 1938. Grace Fitzgerald studiously applied a modest scrape of butter to her morning toast, as her older sister Agnes, while spreading a lot more butter on her own toast, and marmalade as well, grumbled on and on about all the immoral shenanigans in the sleepy town of Knocknashee. Today's diatribe was mostly to do with Peggy Donnelly and the new range of pink and mauve cardigans and scandalously short skirts, barely reaching the knee, she'd put in the window of her shop, the wearing of which was bound to lead to dreadful behaviour among the young people of the town. So we won't be shopping in Peggy's until they're taken down. I don't know what's come over her. Grace, are you listening to me? Agnes leaned in and pointed with her knife. Yes, Agnes, Grace replied, gazing down at her plate. Secretly, she thought Peggy's new display brightened the place up, and doubted very much it would lead to naked dancing and satanic rituals on the Strand. But she couldn't say that sort of thing to Agnes, not even as a joke. Anyway, she didn't want to be cheeky to her sister. She was entirely dependent on Agnes, who had been like a mother to her, as she was often reminded, since their parents died. It had been horrible and so sudden. It still upset Grace to think of it. Eddie and Kathleen Fitzgerald had served as the master and mistress of the school attached to this big stone house. They were on their way back from one of the islands dotted off the coast, where they'd set up a school for the island children, and visited twice a year to bring more resources for the only teacher, a past pupil of theirs who had married an islander. On the way back to Knocknashee, their little boat was caught in a squall and capsized, and they drowned. Grace had just turned 11 when it happened. The Fitzgeralds' only son, Father Morris, had been away on the missions in the Philippines and couldn't come home. So it was Agnes, the second oldest at 26, who had to take over the running of the household and the school. Grace had been a surprise baby, arriving many years after her parents were sure their family was complete. Together, she and Agnes ran the school now, though her sister had no desire to be a teacher. Unlike their parents, who had been much loved, Agnes had no vocation for it. But she did it anyway, she said, to put food on the table for Grace. It was a big sacrifice for her, because it had meant giving up on her plans to marry Cyril Clifford, the son of the local hotelier. Before Mammy and Daddy drowned, Agnes had been sure of a proposal from Cyril. They'd been doing a strong line together for years, and he was considered a fine catch. It was just a matter of time before he put a ring on her finger. But after the accident, everything changed. If Agnes married, the law required her to give up teaching, and Cyril could hardly be expected to take over responsibility for Grace, as well as a new wife and any future children they might have. So until Grace was old enough to look after herself, the marriage was put on hold. Grace knew to be very grateful, because Agnes could have solved the problem in a second, by putting her into an orphanage, the same way Charlie McKenna's children had been sent away, when the postman was left unable to cope after his wife died in childbirth. To make matters even worse for Agnes, a year after their parents died, Grace contracted polio and was rushed to the hospital in Cork. Agnes tried desperately to keep it quiet. People were so frightened of the disease, but of course it got out. And Cyril wrote to Agnes, saying his parents were afraid of him catching polio from the furnishings in her house, and then guests would be put off coming to their hotel, and that it would be best all round to discontinue what he referred to as their friendship. Poor Agnes was humiliated and disgraced in front of the whole place when he married a woman from Limerick, not a wet week after he'd finished it with her. For the next 4 years, Grace was in hospital. Agnes was unable to visit because the school board forbade it on account of the risk to the school children in her charge. Agnes had to manage everything all alone, with a broken heart. No wonder she'd become so unhappy, and saw badness everywhere. Grace had been lucky by comparison. She'd had to have a lot of painful operations and therapies, but at least she'd been well looked after in Cork. The consultant, Dr. Warrington, had such a bright, kind face. Just the memory of him cheered her up. He went so far and beyond for his patients. His wife was a wonderful woman too. She'd put Grace through her school exams, as she did all the children. The couple had no family of their own, and all their loving energy seemed to go into nurturing the suffering youngsters in their care, whose lives had been devastated by the terrible disease. One of Grace's happiest memories was when Mrs. Warrington told her she was so clever that she should train as a teacher at one of the new colleges, instead of learning on the job, as lots of rural teachers did. Though it turned out the doctor's wife had overestimated Grace's abilities. The summer of Grace's leaving cert, when she was 16, she'd finally been allowed home from the hospital. Dr. Warrington had driven her to Knocknashee from Cork himself, so she didn't have to take the train and bus alone. And like his wife, he'd told her he was sure she'd do very well in her exams. But when the results arrived, she'd failed so badly that Agnes was too kind to even show them to her. She'd put the letter into the fire instead. It was probably for the best, as Agnes said. Even if her marks had been good enough, Grace would never have been able to go to teacher training college in Limerick or Dublin. She'd never manage alone, not with a twisted leg and a caliper. And though that door was closed, a window opened. Agnes persuaded Canon Rafferty, the chairman of the school board, to appoint Grace as her teaching assistant. For a small wage from the Department of Education, she could take the 4 to 8-year-olds off Agnes's hands. Grace knew this was good of Agnes, and it was also kind of her sister not to take a penny of her wages for her bed and board. The polio meant she could never be married, not now that she was a cripple. So Agnes insisted that every penny Grace earned went into a savings account in the post office, so she could pay someone to look after her when she was left alone in the world. Unfortunately, this meant Agnes had to pay for everything out of her one wage, and a lot of scrimping and saving went on in their house as a result. Hence the tiny scrape of butter Grace allowed herself for her toast. At times she felt guilty for even existing. Agnes had moved on to another topic now. And as for that Tilly O'Hare girl, walking off the bus from Tralee into the square, wearing a shirt and tie over her skirt, and her hair short like a man's. Bad enough she wears her dead father's overalls around the farm, but a shirt and tie? I don't think she's right in the head. Every seed, breed and generation of the O'Hares were peculiar. So you'd better stay away from her, Grace. Grace took a bite of her toast as a way to hide her grin. She rather wished she'd been there to see it when Tilly got off the bus and caused such a scandal in the town. Agnes was a firm believer in always looking respectable. Today she was wearing a long black skirt, though almost everyone wore knee-length now, and a buttoned-up black cardigan with a white blouse underneath. With her fair hair set in waves, light blue eyes and heavy tortoiseshell glasses, she looked forbidding. But Grace assumed that was her intention. I mean, her sister continued with a deep sigh, that brother of hers, Alfie, going off to Russia. In all honesty, what would take a Christian, God-fearing man to that cradle of sin? And her older sister Marion, shacked up with a married man above in Dublin. Did you ever hear the likes? No shame. Agnes pursed her lips in such a way when she said that last bit that Grace nearly laughed, because it put her in mind of Flossie the tabby cat's bum She had to bite her lip to keep a serious face. It was a shame, because it wasn't as if Agnes was ugly. She would be pretty if she only smiled a bit more. So I have your word. You'll have no more to do with her. Agnes's china blue eyes were fixed on hers. Grace hesitated. She usually went along with whatever Agnes said she should or shouldn't do, or who she should or shouldn't talk to. But Grace was very fond of Tilly, who had written to her a lot while she was in hospital. Those letters had been a lifeline for her. Agnes had been far too busy with her work to write. By the time she'd marked the books of the whole school, because she had no assistant, the most she had time for was a card at birthdays and at Christmas. Tilly was my best friend from school, Agnes, she reminded her sister carefully. Maybe she was, said Agnes, looking very put out. But that was when you were 12 years old. You didn't see her at all while you were in hospital, and you've barely seen her in the years since you've been back. It won't be any trial to you not to see her at all. Grace remained silent. She hadn't told Agnes about Tilly's letters, so as not to sound like she was criticising her sister for not having written more herself. And she tended not to mention the times she and Tilly got together for a walk on the beach, because she knew Agnes might not approve. I don't ask for much, Grace, said Agnes with another deep sigh. God knows you are a worry to me with your flighty ways, but I care for you and ask for nothing in return. I don't mind one bit having to pay for everything in this house out of my own wages, while yours go into a savings account. And all I want in return for all my sacrifices is a commitment to stay away from the likes of Tilly O'Hare. And if you can't grant me that one small request, well, 'tis a sorry state of affairs, I must say. Grace shrunk inside. She knew she was a burden to Agnes. Being so young when their parents died, then catching polio and driving Cyril Clifford away. Coming home from the hospital with her right leg all twisted and shorter than the other, thus ensuring no man would ever look at her, let alone marry her. Failing all her exams, being too soft on the bold children in her care because she didn't understand how to teach properly. How could she go against her sister, who was only trying her best to keep her respectable in the way a schoolteacher had to be? Grace, are you paying attention? I am, Agnes. Then promise me you'll... At that moment, their late father's brass carriage clock on the kitchen mantel struck the half-hour. It had been given by the Irish National Teachers' Organisation for services to the profession, and it kept excellent time. Grace stood up as quickly as she could, a clumsy, noisy, clattering effort because she couldn't bend her bad right leg in the caliper. It's 8:30, Agnes. I'd better be going over. She hoped her sister wouldn't notice that she'd managed not to give a commitment to cut Tilly off. Agnes nodded, satisfied, as she helped herself to another cup of tea and a second slice of thickly buttered toast with more marmalade. Because Grace was only the assistant, she was the one who made sure all the children were in and accounted for, the fires lit, and the 2 classrooms ready for the day. Make sure the blackboard in my room is fully clean, Grace. You left chalk on it yesterday. And tell young Mikey O'Shea I want to see him before school is over. He was trick-acting in the back of Mass on Sunday with his wastrel of a father. Grace's soft heart sank. Poor Mikey was only 6. But she knew if she sent him to see Agnes, he'd get the leather, the poor misfortune. Agnes took being headmistress very seriously. She felt responsible for all the souls in her care. And that meant beating any child who showed a tendency towards sin. In fact, her readiness with the leather strap was the first reason she'd fallen out with the O'Hares, because Mary O'Hare was the only one who had ever dared challenge her. Grace would never forget it. Agnes had slapped Tilly so hard one day, she made her hand bleed. It was in the year Grace's parents had died, and she and Tilly were still only 11. Agnes had taken over the school and was finding it difficult because she was having to fill in for both her parents and teach 40 children instead of 20. So it was hard for her to keep order, particularly with children like Tilly, who was always encouraging the others to laugh. The next day, Mary O'Hare appeared in the classroom, walking stick in hand, the tap-tap of the metal tip on the floorboards heralding her arrival before they saw her. Mrs. O'Hare was a small, stocky woman with a slow gait and a dark moustache of hair on her upper lip. She was a martyr to the rheumatism, but she marched right into the classroom, no knock or a bit, and raised her walking stick at Agnes. "You're only a long string of misery, Agnes Fitzgerald, and no wonder your man Clifford has been trying to escape you for years." "Get out of my classroom," gasped poor Agnes, white with shock. "I will when I'm finished. But listen carefully to me now." Mrs. O'Hare punctuated each word with the point of the stick in Agnes's bony chest. "You lay a scrawny finger of yours on my Tilly ever again, and I swear 'tis the last thing you'll ever do." "You can't threaten me with violence," Agnes had protested, her brow furrowed and her shoulders back. "You'll be sent to prison." "I will not, because I won't lay a hand on you. But I've fairies on my land, remember that, and I've been good to them and they've been good to me." Agnes's face went red. She opened her mouth, probably to say only ignorant people believed in the fairies, but then clearly thought better of it and closed it again. "And don't ye take a tack of notice of this owl kayak," Mary told the class, looking around at them all. Little Grace knew that everyone called Agnes a cailleach behind her back, the Irish word for witch. But this was the first time someone had said it to her face. This would surely go down in the history books as a day no child present would ever forget. She remembered thinking she should speak up in defence of her older sister, but she just sat there in silence, feeling a guilty mixture of delight and terror. Remembering about Mary O'Hare gave Grace an idea that might save Mikey. "If only John O'Shea wasn't so fierce bad-tempered," she said softly as she left the room. "I've been told he has a history of cursing anyone who crosses him." She hoped against hope that Agnes would believe her, even though John O'Shea was the nicest little man you could ever meet. His father, Shawnee O'Shea, had been a Shanachie, a storyteller of renown all over the peninsula, for his wonderful stories of pookas and the banshee and the fairies. He told tales of curses that spanned generations, of thwarted love and wicked people, as well as of great passions, and things that happened long ago that were so funny you'd cry laughing at him. The Shanachie were an ancient role in Irish life, the descendants of the bards of old and very well respected. A family would never refuse hospitality to a Shanachie for fear of being cursed. So she hoped Agnes might have the same concerns about John O'Shea. Agnes said she had no time for the old ways, the mythology and the old pishogues. Silly superstitions of ignorant people, she called them. But she was wary of Mary O'Hare for that reason, and she would never go outside the door on the Feast of Samhain for fear of the dead. 6-year-old Mikey O'Shea had the same sweet nature as his father, but he was a lively boy with a cheeky grin. And last Sunday he'd been hopping around a bit. The canon had been giving a particularly long sermon, but he expected full and complete attention from everyone. He had scowled down from the altar at John and Catherine O'Shea, who were standing at the back with their tribe of small children. and made some pointed remarks about people lacking true devotion. Grace didn't think that was true. The O'Sheas would give a beggar their last bite, even though, like many in Knocknashee, they had real problems raising a large family while working a small farm. Catherine was expecting another baby any day now, and Grace couldn't help feeling that if the O'Sheas didn't look entirely engaged with keeping Mikey in order, maybe they were trying to figure more important things out. She left the kitchen and limped to the hall stand. The leather and metal splint that went from the top of her thigh to her foot, where it slotted into a built-up shoe, was uncomfortable. She managed, but there were times when she longed to walk upright and straight. Then she would remind herself of all the other children she'd known in the Victoria Hospital in Cork, struck down by the horrible infection. The little ones who had to go into the terrifying iron lung because their chests were affected, or those who died. And some children had both arms and legs paralysed. She was very lucky. She was spared the worst. All she had was one discoloured and twisted leg that was permanently cold, and a caliper to strengthen the muscles weakened from the disease. Dr. Ryan, the local GP, had checked her over when she came home and told her she had Dr. Warrington to thank for being as mobile as she was. The Cork consultant was a great man, and someone Dr. Ryan much admired. Standing at the mirror in the small hallway, she brushed her thick auburn hair, frustratingly curly, and pinned her hat on. She had Daddy's hair and also his eyes, large and green and flecked with amber. She didn't have his height. He had been over 6 feet, but Grace had never been tall, and the polio had shortened her even more, so she was only 4'11". Sometimes she thought she looked like one of those collectible china dolls with her pert little nose and curved, slightly pouting lips. "I'm right queer looking, and no mistake," she sighed, as she fixed a stray curl under her hat. But then she mentally shook herself and told herself to count her blessings, as she did every night when she said her prayers before bed. She might never marry or have her own children, but she had the children of the town to look after, and it was a wonderful job, and she loved it. She had a roof over her head and a way of earning her living. She had her books to comfort her. She was currently reading The Count of Monte Cristo. And at least she wasn't a prisoner in a dungeon like Edmond Dantes. She was alive and free. "Come on, Grace," she ordered. "You've so much to be grateful for, so put your best foot forward. Isn't that what Dr. Warrington used to say?" A little in-joke, since she only had one good foot. She often wished she could see the good doctor and his wife again, but they had other little girls and boys to care for, and they could hardly be expected to keep in touch with every child who had passed through their hands.